All right, class. We're gonna go. Um, I'm gonna go over the tutorial that we would have done today in class. And before I get to that point, I'm going to go over some of the tools that we went over last week in Thursday's class. So this way, anyone that wants a refresher or have a reference back to what we did, it'll all be in one place. All right. So to start, very quickly, setting up the new file in Illustrator. Um, Illustrator is open, Command N, get a new document, and then what we want to do is set up our file for our 1117 poster. So in here, we're going to select inches instead of pixels. We're going to change this to 11, and then 17 for height. Now the bleed, remember the bleed is important for um, shifting, and also this way when you trim down your posters, you won't have any white edges to your print. So basically just 1/8 of an inch, 0.125 all the way around is all you need. Make sure you're CMYK, which usually by default it is, and then hit create. Okay, so we have our file again. Remember, it goes right to the edge of the white, and then the red is your actual bleed. So anytime that you want something to go off to the edge of your page, you bring it all the way to the red line. All right. Now saving it, we're going to go and we're going to save it as a PDF. And so we're going to go to Save As. And we're going to name it Project 1, and then select PDF. And then we're going to hit Save. And this next screen, we want to go down to Marks and Bleeds. And all we need is trim marks. And make sure Use Document Bleed Settings is set. Because you can see the 1/8 of an inch that we put in as a value at the beginning of the process is right there. So you hit save. And it should be right here. So when we take a look at it, you can see our trim marks are sitting right there. So we're good to go. All right. All right. Okay, so the next thing, talking about the text tool. Let me pull up my character and my tools so you guys can see them. Okay, so the type tool sits here. You can simply just hit T on your keyboard and you'll end up getting the type tool. So there were multiple ways of inserting text. The first was simply just clicking on the screen and then typing out and having your text sit in a separate text box, right? So this sits here on a text line rather. And the advantages of this is that you have this bounding box that goes around that text. So if we hold shift, we could pull and increase and decrease the size of the file, right? If we don't hold shift, then we distort the type, which is what we never want to do. All right. The other way of inserting text was by creating an actual text box. Instead of just clicking on the screen, we click and hold and drag, and we drop text inside the text box. So this here, you can see, is sitting in here constrained. If we didn't, let me just copy this first paragraph. If we didn't create a text box with this, and we simply just did what we did up here, you can see then the text box just keeps, the text line rather, just keeps running all the way off the page. So if you're going to be doing just a line of text, then this is a better process of doing so because then you can control the size easier. This, you want to contain it within a text box itself. So if it's a body of text, copy text, it sits in here. Now, with the bounding box sitting here, you can change the size of the box itself, remember, but you can't change the text size inside. So this simply changes the box itself, so the width, right? So unlike this, So those are the two advantages and disadvantages of using one or the other. The other one is how you can quickly and easily rotate a line of text like so, but if we try and rotate this, it will keep the text perfectly horizontal. All right? Okay. Some of the things that are up here, right? So to refresh this here is our family. So if we want to change, to a different family, underneath is the style. Underneath that, this here is the type size itself. Okay. To the right of that is your leading. So the leading is really only the spacing in between your lines of text. So by default, it's 120% of whatever your type is, right? So you can see a little bracket around it. That tells you that this is the default 120 optimal readability for type. So when you increase, you can see you get rid of that parentheses because now it's no longer default. If you want to go back to it, you simply go back to auto, and it puts it back to 120% of whatever this type size is. So this here is a leading, that's spacing in between your lines of text. You can even, and it doesn't have to be in this. So if we have this sitting here as well, same thing. You control so no matter what you have selected, this will always control the spacing in between the lines. Directly underneath that was the tracking. So this here will be the spacing between horizontally. So in between each of the letters, you increase the spacing. All right. To the left of that is your kerning. So there are many times that a kerning pair is improper. A lot of times when you try and use all caps is usually when you have issues with kerning. Or if you download a free typeface, there'll be issues with kerning. So what you do is you place your cursor in between two letters so it's flashing, and then you would be able to tighten or loosen the space in between just those two glyphs while leaving everything else intact. All right. Underneath here, 100, you should, whenever you're designing anything with type, you should really always try and keep this set at 100. If you want something that is a condensed typeface, then find a typeface that was developed to be a condensed typeface, because what happens is it ends up causing an issue with the stroke as it goes through, and then there are times that maybe that type isn't going to read as well as it should. So whenever you want something that looks like a more condensed face or expanded, if it's wider, then find a typeface that has that option. All right. Underneath this is here. The only time I ever use this is when I want to basically do like a superscript. So I'll change the size of whatever that is and then push it up. So this controls the baseline. So you can see the red isn't really the baseline. Baseline is underneath. So you can see this baseline sitting here that goes underneath the letters, and you're basically just adjusting that baseline. All right. So that was basically what we went over for the type itself. We also went over the alignment. So if we pull in our paragraph tab, we have our left, we have our centered, we have our right, and then we have these justified type. So when you have your justified, it basically makes the type into a block of text. Anytime that you have a block of text, you also want to utilize hanging punctuation. So what that does is you can see how the type kind of goes in and out, especially with these hyphenations. Let me try and turn off that and I'm just going to add one in here. So put one here. The advantages of using dummy text. All right, so you can see as you run down, the eye kind of sees like this jumps out a little bit, right? So when we come up here, so in the paragraph, you have these 3 lines. You want to select hanging punctuation. And what that does, it pushes whatever that punctuation out of that text box. So this way then, it creates a nice straight line for the type itself. All right. The only time you need to worry about this is if you're using justified type. That's it. That's the only time you need to worry about it. Well, there are other times, but let's simplify it for right now. So when you have justified type in a paragraph, utilize hanging punctuation. Okay, the next thing we went over, which I think a lot of you despised thoroughly, the pen tool. So the pen tool is right here. You can just hit P on your keyboard. And what this does is it creates Bezier curves and shapes based on the points, anchor points, and those handles. So right here is an anchor point, here's a handle. So when you end up pulling that handle, you adjust the curvature of those anchor points that are connected. All right. If you don't click and drag, then you have no handles, right? There's no Bezier curve. You simply just have an anchor point with a straight line to another anchor point, like so. Okay. So if you want those nice curves, then you need to click and drag your pen as you go through. All right. Underneath that is your curvature tool. So this one here kind of allows you to click and drag and draw those curves without pulling your pen. I find this tool to be a little cumbersome, but again, it's because I've used this program for many years that I'm comfortable clicking and dragging using the pen tool and creating my own curvature as opposed to allowing this. It does help, especially when you're trying to create something that is, say, maybe some sort of design element. You want to make sure that your curve is a little bit more natural and doesn't have a sharp edge to it, right? So there are times that this is useful. But yeah, so that's another way of having a curve using the pen tool. Once you have the line set up, then you would use your white arrow and select just like these anchor points and the handles. You can move them around, adjust whatever you have going on. There are also ways to adjust this that we'll go into more another day. You can see when you select something that is sharp, this little dot shows up where you can adjust and smooth out that curve. You can also smooth out multiple curves at once. So I have these three selected, and when I pull one of them, all three changes. All right, but we're gonna go over more of that another time. All right, so now that you have these curves, now if we select one of them and we go to our type tool, you can see the type tool has a little box around the text. Once we hover over that line, you can click, and then you have your text sitting there. All right, I'm gonna put this back to where it is. So now this type sits on that line. All right. If we were, say, we wanted to flip this around, or maybe I don't want it to start at this location, you can see when that text is selected, you have a beginning and an end and a middle. So if I pull this end piece, you can see how it closes into that text line. If I pull this piece, it changes where it begins. The middle will change between one side and the other. Okay, this is very useful when we're typing on a circle, and there are many times you want it to be on the outside or on the inside. This will make you flip from one side to the other. All right, done. All right, so now creating a shape to type in. So with the pen tool, you can create any kind of shape you want. And then using the type tool, now when you hover over, it doesn't have a line through it like it did when we had the curve, but now it's a circle. So that tells you that it's going to be sitting inside this shape. All right. So let me get rid of this for a second. Do that again with more type. type tool, click, and there's a text sitting inside that shape. All right, and it could be any kind of shape you want, right? So let's talk about creating shape itself using the shape tool. Actually, wait, that's for the next. That's what we're doing today. I have two more things that we did on Thursday. All right. Okay. So the other thing was outlining type. So now, if we had our text and we wanted to adjust this text itself with that type selected, I'm going to make a copy. We hit Command-Shift-O to make it into an outline. All right. So then we would select the white arrow, just like the white arrow that we would use to adjust the curvature of the Bezier curve. And we can select parts of this letter and adjust just those elements, right? So say like for some reason we wanted to delete the counter of this, we can select just that part. Maybe if we wanted to delete part of this, we can select just those and hit delete. All right, so it allows you to pull parts of the letter itself. You can't do that when it's typed. So you can see, even if I'm trying to select parts of it, this is still being seen as text, where this is no longer text. This is now artwork or an outline. All right. Okay, so now let's now we can go on to today's tutorial. So the first thing underneath the type tool is a line tool. All right, sitting here. You have other options here like an arc tool, but this here will draw a straight line. So right now this line is no fill, no line. So you can see there's a line through that and a line through that. So let's get no fill and a black line. And you click and drag, right? So it's just a straight line. No matter where you drag your line, it ends, right? Short lines. Now, if you want straight lines that go perfectly horizontal, then hold Shift as you pull. So now that line is perfectly straight. And it goes on 45s. All right, so anytime that you hold Shift, even when you want to rotate something, if you hold Shift, it will rotate at 45 degrees increments. All right, so that's the line tool. Underneath that are your shape tool. So the first one is a rectangle. So you click and drag, right? The other option is your rounded rectangle. So you end up having rounded edges. The tool underneath that is going to be your ellipse tool, right? So if you don't hold Shift, you can create ovals. If you hold Shift, you create a perfect circle, all right? So even with all of these shapes, you can use them as text boxes as well, all right? So instead of using the pen tool to create a shape, we can use a circle and then type inside it, all right? Now, we can also type on a line. The issue is when you have a filled object, anytime that you try and hover over it, it's going to want to, by default, type inside. So if you want to type on the outside of this circle, you need to hold on to the type tool and force it. So select type on a path. So now once we click, now that type sits on that outside edge of that circle. And then now remember how I said that middle thing in the middle for the type? It will allow you to type on the inside or on the outside. All right, and then same thing. We want this to start here, and we want it to end here. Okay, so the same tools that we used on that path can also be used on that shape. All right, the other tool, Polygon. So this here, if we want to have a specific size of a polygon, and then how many sides of that polygon that we want. All right. Then underneath that is a star. So there are two different types of stars, right? We have this one here. You can see the angle of these. And then if we hold Option and Shift, you can see a more pointed, less a little bit more defined in a way, right? So those are the two different stars itself. And then we will go over that later. All right, so we got those shapes. All right, so now that we know how to create simple shapes, there's another part to setting up your file that we have to discuss. Just as we set up a bleed to help with any kind of shifting with the print and making it a little bit easier to cut out, to having the trim marks. Imagine worst case scenario that your print does shift, right? So you don't want to have any white edge with any shifting. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you don't want anything too close to the edge that gets cut off and is eliminated. So it's wise to have a bleed to tell you where you should keep important information away from the edge. You also want to think about how much space you really want for a margin, right? So just simply coming in here and having 10.75 and then 16.75. Just having this sitting here is allowing to have that bleed, right? To have that inside margin. So you know not to have anything go beyond that. But you do want more. That's the bare minimum. So what you want to do is you want to create something in maybe like say a ½ inch or even an inch. Sometimes if you end up having something like this, right? So it's a nice amount of space away from your edge. So that there really is no rule. It really depends on your design, your style, what you want it to look like. If you're doing a design that, you know, say is for something that is very chaotic, something that is claustrophobic or along those lines, maybe you do want something to go right to the edge. But if you do want to bring some negative space into your layout, then maybe you do want to end up having a little bit wider margin in your design. And it really depends on everybody and what they're going for. All right, so what I'm going to do is I want a ½ inch around my entire design. So therefore you're subtracting an inch all the way around. So we're going to do 10 by 16 and hit OK. All right. Now, simply coming up here and trying to eyeball where that center is isn't the best way of getting it to be dead center. All right. So up here, you have these options. And by default, on most computers, you're going to end up having a line 2 selection. All right. So you want to make sure you have a line 2 artboard selected. And then you want to center it and then center it. So now that rectangle is dead center to that artboard. Once that's set, we don't want that to print. We want it to be a guide, right? We don't want to have our design have this black rectangle in our layout. So with that selected, hit Command 5 to make it into a guide. So now when this prints, this is not going to print. We have this strictly for us to see where the edges of that inside margin is going to be. All right. There are times that we want to use other guides, right? So right now, I have no ruler showing. So if we hit Command R, we'll have rulers show up here. If you drag down into your design, you'll drag a ruler, or a guide rather, all the way across. Same way over here, right? So this helps if you're trying to align certain elements across your composition. You want to stay balanced. You want to keep everything aligned properly. You know, maybe you have type sitting up here and you want to make sure the footer is aligned to it, right? So maybe you draw a guide to kind of show where it is. Or maybe you're just trying to make sure that an element on the left-hand side is aligned to the right-hand side visually. So you draw a guide down. Now, there are times that, you know, this margin guide is important. We need to keep it throughout our project. But once we use this guide, we no longer want that guide sitting there throughout the entire project. It'll become frustratingly annoying and getting in the way. So you can release your guides, Option Command colon, and now you can see all of the guides are selectable. Right? So now we can select this guide, this guide, and this guide. Right? And then now we want to lock this back in because we don't want to accidentally grab this and move it off of it being centered to our design. So all you need to do is toggle it, Option Command colon, and now that's sitting there and you cannot move it around. All right. Okay. Now strokes. So let's pull this in. Get this out of here. All right. So now say we have we got a design that has like an element like so, and by default it's 1 point is the stroke for this. If we want that line to be thicker, then we can increase the stroke to whatever we want. All right. So this here is for anything that you have a stroke, right? So right here we have a rectangle with a 29-point stroke. Now with the rectangle, you have other options besides just changing the size of the stroke. We have this corner. So if we don't want this hard edge corner, we can have it rounded like so. We can also have it sit here and have more of like a straight edge bevel element to it, like that. Then another part that's important is where that stroke aligns. So default, it aligns in the center. So you can see the blue is the size of the rectangle, and the stroke goes out from both the outside and the inside. If we change it to the inside, you can see it starts at where that line was and goes inward, or starts in the outside, starts at the line and goes outside. All right, so it depends on what it is that you are looking for your design, depending on what you're going to be doing here. When you have just a line, you have different options for how the cap ends, right? So this is default. This here we could have a little rounded element to it. And then the other option, it allows it to be exactly what that thickness is on the outside. All right, so this way, instead of having it cap right at where that point ends, you allow it to extend. So this way, if you're trying to align certain elements together with different strokes, you don't have an issue with things looking like they're a little bit off. All right. Okay. So we talked about rotating with the type. So when we had just simply typing out in a text element, we could rotate, right? Same thing with these here. You can rotate. And then the other thing is when you shrink it down, actually let me make a copy. When you shrink this down, it retains the thickness of that stroke. You can see 23 point, 23 point. All right. There are times that you don't want that. There are times that you're, all right, I have a 23-point stroke and I actually want it to shrink down along with the size. I want it to be proportionate. All right. So what you need to do is you need to go up to your document settings. Where are we? What am I having on? There we go. No, where are my preferences? Sorry, guys. So we go into General, and right over here, you have your Scale, Strokes, and Effects. It's deselected by default, but if you select it, and then we hit OK, now, if I make a copy of this and I shrink it down, it will shrink down the stroke weight along with it. So now you can see this is actually 8.8 as opposed to 23. All right. And if we enlarge, then you can see it increases proportionally to whatever that size is. All right. There are times that you want one or the other. And you're going to need to go in there and change that right here, Scale, Strokes, and Effects. All right. Okay. Pathfinder. Okay, so now there are times that you want to eliminate. Where's my Pathfinder? Okay. there are times that you're going to want to remove part of something for a design. So let's say that we have this rectangle sitting here, and we actually want to cut out part of this for the design. So you would come in here, you would draw another object, maybe changing the color so it's easy to see the difference. And then you want to eliminate this part from the block, right? So all of these are going to give that option for you. So you select both objects, and if you just let your mouse hover over these buttons, it'll actually tell you. I mean, the icon tells you what they're going to do, but it'll tell you exactly underneath what's going to happen. So this is minus front, unite, intersect, right? So what we want to do is we actually want to remove the yellow circle from the black rectangle behind. So that's minus front. We select that, and you can see it removes that yellow piece, and now we're left with just the black piece that was underneath. Now say that we want to create an object that has these elements that are now creating one shape instead of these three. Then we would hit unite. And now those three elements are sitting there as one. All right, so now let's say we have a design. Let's bring back some pieces here. We have a design, and you get to a certain point where you're going to shift gears. You're kind of at a fork in the road, and you're saying, all right, I want to try and go in a different direction. All right. Now, it's important to keep track of your process. It's important to keep track of bad designs, and you want to have all of that information there for you. So what you do is you can save multiple files if you want. Me personally, I'd rather have one file. It's less to worry about, and I have everything contained in one area. So you zoom out until you can see a lot of the gray area around your artboard. And down towards the bottom, you have your Artboard tool. With that selected, you would hold Option, and you can see the cursor changes from the crosshair to a black and white arrow, telling me that I'm going to copy something. So now when I drag and I move to the right, I make a copy of whatever that artboard is. So as I'm working, I can make as many quick copies of what I'm working on and then continue working. All right, you can have multiple artboards in one file. Now, as you're working and you're getting close to the end of your process, again, you don't want to delete everything, right? So, whatever the case may be, let's see. All right, so we have different things going on, and we want to now solidify and say, all right, this one here is a winner, right? These here, I don't want to submit. I don't want to hand these in, but you don't want to delete them either, right? You want to keep them because either future reference or maybe you have notes or whatever the case may be. It's wise to keep things out in the gray area. Like there are many times that I write notes to myself or different renditions of a design that just wasn't working. I throw up in the gray area outside of the artboard. But when you have multiple artboards, all you need to do is go back to the Artboard tool, select on the artboard you don't want, and hit delete. So it leaves your artwork alone, right? But it doesn't get rid of anything that you have going on. It just allows your document to only have this one artboard. All right? So that's what I would like you to get used to, especially when you're working in design. I'm sorry, when you're working in Illustrator. Allow yourself to make these copies of the artboard, so this way then you can continue working on multiple ideas quickly, and you keep everything contained in one file. And then when it comes time to hand in your project and print it, then you delete all the artboards that you don't want to keep. All right. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to talk about the rulers is we have it set to inches, right? If you need to change the measurement to, say, pixels or pica or points, then you just right-click in the ruler itself and quickly change it that way. All right, so you don't need to go up to your document settings or anything else. You can quickly just change it this way. All right, layers. So like I said before, there's many times that I throw notes as I'm working. If I get feedback from a client and they say, hey, I'd really like to see this change to this design, I'll actually put that information into the document. So this way it's there in front of me as I'm working on it, and I throw it out into the gray area. But there are also times that you might take notes or something that you want to put directly on top of something, right? So we have our layers here. We have one layer, and if we create a new layer by clicking this button, it sits on top of whatever that layer is selected. And I want to write a note about something underneath this, but I don't want it to accidentally print, right? So I'm gonna put it into this here. So now you can see the changes in color, right? So whatever that color is on the side over here is represented by when you select an object. So as we're selecting any of these, they're blue. But when I select this, it's red. If we create another one, and we put something in that layer, now that's green. So it helps you identify what the items and where they belong into which layer, okay? So I wanna have this sitting here as like a note for myself, and I don't want it to print. So when you have that sitting here, you double click that layer option. You can name them a different name if you need to, but you can see this right here, print. If we deselect that and hit OK, now I can write notes about what I'm trying to do, and it will be visible, but it will not print. All right. So if you want to have a note and don't write it in the gray area, and you want to like have it, sitting on your design, maybe you're taking notes during your crit, and people giving you feedback about certain parts of the design that you want to remember, that this goes to that specific point. You can drop notes on top of your artwork, and then just change the layer to not print, and you won't have to worry about accidentally printing your notes. All right. I personally prefer keeping everything out in the gray area, but there are times when I will use, maybe not for note taking, but there are times that I will use this method of turning off the print option. Maybe there's like a guide that I drop down, or some other alignment, or if I'm trying to mimic something and I drop it in there, I don't want it to become part of the project. And if I accidentally don't forget to delete it or whatever else, I'll throw it in there and turn off that print option. All right. Okay. Yeah, so we already talked about the different things. The other thing that for some reason I lost track of notes, we did discuss color on Thursday. So let me pull up color and swatches. Where are my swatches? There they are. Okay. Throw those out. Okay, so with color, like I talked about before, everything that we see on screen is RGB. It's using red, green, and blue to mix together those colors to give you, the representation of what that color is. But when we print, it uses CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So the two don't go hand in hand. And there are certain colors that definitely, cannot be printed that you see on screen, right? Green and blue, for instance, is notorious for being out of gamut. Out of gamut means that it's not possible to print that using a CMYK breakdown. But yeah, so we click here, we have the the difference color. Let's throw it on top of this. And I talked about changing shades of a color. So this is important for this project specifically because color is a huge part of how someone is going to react to your design, um, and how you can construct a layout using certain colors. I did tell you, I hope everybody remembers that there is a part 2 of the project I told you to ignore as far as a monochromatic using only one color. I do want you to have that freedom to be able to use different colors, not every single color, but there are reasons why you would want to bring in certain colors to help represent what it is that you're designing for. Now, one of the things is when you create shades or different versions of a certain color. So a lot of times, let me separate these out. A lot of times you'd want to have maybe um, a slightly lighter color here. So that's 34% of that color, and 65, say. All right. So this here is the opacity. So that all that is doing is changing the transparency of that shape. Now, when it goes over, let's change this to a different color. You can see that all it's doing is overlaying those colors on top of one another. It's not actually changing that shape, or I'm sorry, changing the shade itself. So this will sometimes cause an issue. Sometimes it's exactly what you do want. But if all we're looking for is a different shade of a certain color, that's not what we really want to do. All right, so with this sitting here, we want to be able to see that different shade on top of that, right? So let's bring this back to 100. And then over here, when you change one handle, you can see you only affect that one color. If you hold Shift and drag, you can see how it's changing the cyan along with the yellow. So now you can see that it changes a little bit lighter of that version of that green. All right, and if we had picked a color that had all 4 handles going, you would see all 4 handles move down together. All right, so now that's how you change and select shades of a certain color as opposed to using your opacity. All right. Okay, so that really was the tutorial for today of what we were doing. Um, the other thing that I was going to, walk around the room, I wanted to see, a more refined idea of what direction you were going. Again, take a look at the revised schedule that I worked out over the weekend, which is ironic because I changed that and in today's class. But I guess it's a little bit of foreshadowing, I guess. But yeah, so we have a couple extra classes. So this way, none of you should feel a little bit rushed as you're working out your ideas for this first project, and kind of ease in a little bit more into the project. All right. Um, One of the things that I wanted to start looking at is your mood board, right? So as you're collecting all this research and thinking about, what images you may want to use, what color schemes, even down to the typefaces that you'll be using, all of that information should be going into a separate file. Honestly, just create a letter size. So come up here, create new. So go, actually, just hit a preset, 8.5 by 11, create, and then in here, save it as a mood board. All right, so project 1 mood board, change it to a PDF, and hit save. And then this here is really where you drop in all of your ideas, and it changes as you progress your design. So when you start coming up with your color scheme, it goes in there. But it's not just what you're doing. I really want to know the why. I chose this color because it reminds me of this, or other people, kind of have this reaction towards that color. I chose this typeface because ... Right? So always have the rationale behind your decision making in the mood board as well. Okay. Um, Nice spelling right there. So yeah, so that is the tutorial that we were doing, and hopefully it helps. Hopefully, if anybody that had any questions regarding some of the tools that we did on Thursday, you now have that to reference. And then on Thursday's class this week, we'll be going over Photoshop, preparing images to bring into our design, and how we can marry the two programs to kind of build that composition up, and what that brings out for our thoughts and everything. All right. So I hope everyone has a good day. Again, I apologize, but I will see you on Thursday. If anybody has any questions, please email me. And if you even want to meet, tomorrow I do have free time to jump online. And if anybody wants to discuss their work, I am available. All right. Have a good one, and I will see you Thursday.